So I was a relatively new psychologist in private practice at the time. And on that day, I thought I should go to work. I should see if I can help people through this trauma. On September 11, 2001, people didn't want to talk about it. People wanted to talk about what was going on in their lives. It wasn't until the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th that people were open to actually talking.
Was it an immediate shock, you think,
this
or just
massive immediate shock and trauma that I think we had no idea how to assimilate, because if you remember, we were still scared. In those days ensuing, we thought, we don't know what's coming next still, you know? And so there was this ongoing collective trauma that we were all experiencing, and I think we kind of all worked through it gradually together.
And something so massive, I mean, I kind of compare it to JFK's assassination, where people remember exactly where they were the day that that happened, and just how it impacts you when it may not have a direct impact on you. And were you in Chicago at the time of your practice?
Yes.
So I know there was a lot of fear there. People were wondering, is it going to be the Sears Tower, now Willis Tower? They were wondering, will it be another tall building downtown? So it did really affect us being the next major city, you know, west of New York.
Yeah. And look, people were impacted way deeper than maybe some of us who didn't have a direct connection to a family member or friend that were unfortunately in those towers at that terrible time. But I'm old enough to think about, you know, what time was like before it and what time is like after it. You think about that naive sense of feeling that we had as Americans, that invincibility, that we were untouchable, that these things couldn't happen in our country. And just think about how you used to operate when you used to get on an airplane. Like, security wasn't nearly what it is today. We complain about it, but it's a necessary thing. Think about the word terror and what the word terror meant to us pre-2001 and then post-2001. And it's just that word alone identifies, and how we identify with it now as opposed to then is huge, right, Doc?
Yeah, I think we have no real bead on the degree to which that moment affected the culture overall, what we do in airports, how we think about the safety of our children when we drop them off at school in the morning. It has an impact, because terror, the point of terror isn't the event. The point of terror is how we feel in the wake of the event, right? We're terrorized, we're fearful. And I don't know if that's gone away in 17 years.
From your professional opinion, is there a way that we should be moving throughout the world? I wasn't directly impacted by 9/11, but we're talking now, we all have been impacted in our everyday lives. And I think that these are the daily stressors that people have naturally, but in this day and age, I think it's different. When you have children and you're worried about moving throughout the city, and just what would you give us with your professional expertise?
I think it's important to trust that by and large, we're safe. You know what I mean? This was an anomaly. This was a bizarre event on a bizarre day, and we've done an awful lot to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. So I think the most important thing we can do is go on with our lives. The best way to honor the 3,000 people who were lost that day is to live your life the best way you can.
Yeah, and it brings me back to resiliency, and I think that's one thing that us Americans have shown is the ability to be resilient. I even look at our president, who was embattled at that time. I remember how I viewed President George Bush pre 9/11, and then I remember how he lifted up the country during that time, and he became our beacon of strength and represented us. I remember when he first appeared at Ground Zero. I remember when he threw out that first pitch at Yankee Stadium during the Yankees playoffs, and the sense of pride I had is, we can move on from this. And conversely, and I'm not making this a political statement at all, but think about how we looked at Rudy Giuliani then as opposed to now how he's viewed. It's kind of wild how over 17 years, the transition and the effects and the impacts, the ripple down that this has had. So it's definitely a day where we like to stop, look back and reflect on those lives lost. There's a lot of courageous behavior that day that prevented even more terror from making its way through our country.
I think that's the silver lining. In a time where our nation is so divided and we're all just yelling at each other from two different sides of the room, like, remember how it brought us together, and like that's how we should be moving forward.
Yeah, and remember how much further we have progressed forward and how resilient we are.
I think it's so important to look back at these images, because I recall seeing them, but looking back now, it's still shocking, right? I think we're still in this kind of post-traumatic state, this kind of before and after the terror attack actually took place, you know? And I think a little bit in the back of our minds, we're always worried, could this happen again? Could anything like this ever happen on American soil again?
We didn't think it ever, that's not a thought that was in our head, but now it's kind of forever imprinted there as this did happen.
Yeah.
What could happen tomorrow? You said as a psychologist that you actually did have to discuss this with your patients, but a lot of them needed time to process.
It was interesting because on 9/11, I went to work and I thought, I'm going to have to help people through this traumatic day. And on that day, maybe even the day after, people didn't want to talk about it at all. By the 13th, 14th, 15th, we were talking about it a lot. So there was this little refractory period where people just needed to assimilate it and find a way to get back to living a life that felt remotely normal.
Yeah, you know, the two words that I think of post 9/11 are terror and are paranoia. Meaning terror was not a word that was really in our vernacular in terms of globally, or let's just take it nationally within our country. Terror wasn't a word that it's become now since 9/11, where terrorist attack, terror, it's permeated through kind of life in the last 17 years through different events that have happened. And then I think of the word paranoia, which has also become a word that's come to the forefront post 9/11. Paranoia of brown-skinned people that may have the look of what a terrorist is, or if we should trust these people. That rhetoric has been something that's always been troubling to me because it's been very unfair for sure. It's something that's popped up. That paranoia when people get on an airplane and look at people and wonder if this is going to be that dangerous thing. And then taking away from that look, which is something I've never approved of or subscribed to, but also just a paranoia when you go places. Now you're thinking the worst, Doc, and that's something I would imagine you'd advise against, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we want to assume the best in people, assume the best in safety, and we want to pass that down, those assumptions down to our children, because terror is a psychological concept, right? The event itself is important to terrorists. The fallout of the event is even more important, and I think the less it's important to remember the event itself and to honor the people who were fallen and the people who helped, but I think it's just as important to move forward with our lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I guess I want to say, like, to use that strategy as I'm honoring them by moving forward with the rest of our lives, like living the best life that we possibly can.
Absolutely, absolutely. What better way to honor somebody who's fallen in any way, but especially in a tragic way like this?
Yeah, and resiliency, going back to, you know, taking us a look in that moment when we hit the apex of tragedy,
right,
and how our country came together, different walks of life, imagine this, different political beliefs that could come together for a greater cause and band together. And you'd love to see in the place where you're in now, whether you support this president, whether you do not, whether you sit on this side of the aisle, whether you're this sexual orientation, whether you're this race, religion, or creed, that maybe we don't need a tragedy to bring us together. Maybe we can look back and say, look how we came together in 2001 when tragedy occurred.
Yeah.
Why not? Let's not wait for that. Let's just band back and be that kind of civilization and be that culture and be that country that we were in the days after 9/11.
I love that sentiment so much, right? Because we all remember how we came together in those few days afterwards, right? The thing that mattered was that we were coalesced as a people. I don't think we need tragedy in order to get back there.
Exactly.